Dear ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to deliver a paper as a keynote speaker of the Global Conference on Advances in Education and Research hosted by Tohoku University of Community Service and Science. One of my research areas for many years has been the German and Russian literary postmodernism. And today I want to discuss with you my reflections on the term postmodernism, an interdisciplinary term that recently, in view of the post-truth debates, has been experiencing a certain revival in various humanities and social disciplines. I will speak on postmodernism as a literary movement or style and as a certain worldview that characterizes, as it is often claimed, the current historical period which, at some moment in the second half of the 20th century, should have replaced modernity. Both as an art movement and a thought paradigm, postmodernism is definitely a transnational or even global phenomenon that is often brought in connection with epistemological crises manifested in various crises of democracies, education and science. Therefore, I thought that at our conference, whose topic is Increasing Globalization and Changes in Education and Research, a discussion of what postmodernism is and whether it presents a challenge to philosophy of science as such might be fruitful, and I invite you to reflect on these issues regardless of your particular research area. The term postmodernism was most likely used for the first time 1870 by the British painter John Watkins Chapman, who used it to define the new avant-gardist style in art, which was later called post-impressionism. So, this year, 2020, it is a 150th anniversary of the word postmodernism, but not of the concept. The concepts of postmodernism and postmodernity aroused an intense discussion in European and American human sciences in the 1980s and 1990s, when various humanities reflected on postmodernity as a new historical era and a cultural paradigm, and on postmodernism as a new art movement in Western cultures. The postmodern debate started as a response to Jürgen Habermas's essay Modernity, an Incomplete Project of 1981. Philosophers that are often considered as founders of postmodernist thinking are mostly the French scholars who at the same time are associated with post-structuralism. It is Jean-François Lyotard, Jean Baudrillard, Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes. In German thought, it is Wolfgang Welsch. Their works inspired a postmodern movement in various humanities and social sciences, as literary theory and cultural studies, psychology, philosophy, economics, educational science, communication studies, and others. Identifying themselves with postmodernism, these fields assumed that this new era began with such development in late capitalism as post-industrial society. The postmodern debate in 1980s and 1990s saw the following beliefs dominate politics, art and thought in general in the second half of the 20th century. A renunciation of the concept of truth, or questioning it at least, and relativism in general, pluralism of views that presumes equality of all standpoints, anti-historicism as notion that historiography is always biased, impersonality, the belief that behavior models and other processes in postmodern society are often predetermined by discourse and cultural codes, so that these are not politicians, writers and journalists speaking to us in mass media or elsewhere, but an impersonal collective entity. Simulation, which is connected with ever-growing dominance of mass media. Though comprehensively described, postmodernism as a new historical or cultural era still remains controversial. The very existence of postmodern age that was often contrasted with modernism and modernity was a significant part of the postmodern debate. When we speak of fiction and art in general, the crucial questions of the postmodern discussion were also the following. When does modernism end and postmodernism begin? Is there a reliable model for separating the modernist poetics from postmodernist one? The most significant analysis of poetics of postmodernist art and literature, in my opinion, were proposed by Frederick Jameson, Linda Hutcheon, Ihab Hassan, Umberto Eco, Peter Kozlowski and Mark Lipovetsky. Postmodernist poetics has been identified with simulacra or empty signs, pastiche as a new genre, if there are any genres at all, irony and possibility of hermeneutical readings, foregrounding of language or code, which means reflection on the code itself, stylistic mimicry or lack of own style, schizophrenia, picturing of sex and violence, absurd. The list of postmodern features could be continued eternally, and such lists were often made, probably the most popular one contrasting postmodernism with modernism by Ihab Hassan. You can easily find it on the web. Similarly, as the question whether postmodernism is an historical error still remains open, in literary studies, when analyzing a work of fiction, we often have to ask ourselves how relevant this distinction between modernist and postmodernist poetics are. I have to remark here that my own observations over postmodernist literature are grounded on the following authors. In America, it's Bret Easton Ellis, Thomas Pynchon. In Germany, Oswald Wiener, Patrick Süskind, Christoph Ransmayr, Kurt Dravert, Elfriede Jelinek, Christian Kracht. As the origins of postmodernist aesthetic were often found in mass media and advertisement practices, which existed in capitalist societies and did not in the socialist ones, the emergence of Russian and other East European postmodernist literatures was unexpected. Such Russian authors as Venedikt Yerofeev, Vladimir Sorokin, Tatiana Tolstaya, and Viktor Pelevin deconstruct not discourses and lifestyles of capitalist societies, but mainly socialist realism and the Soviet official language. This deconstruction uses all possible satiric tools developed in literature. So Tatiana Tolstaya uses dystopia. Vladimir Sorokin's characters often speak the language of Soviet newspapers. He often disrupts his narrative with sex and violence scenes, embodies metaphors of socialist discourse, or lets the text fade away. Viktor Pelevin proposes alternative fantastic versions of the origins of Soviet ideologies. The tricky point in analyzing postmodernist fiction is that any poetic feature you ascribe postmodernism as typical can be found in previous literary epochs, whether irony or subversion of genres, or picturing violence and sex, or foregrounding the language, or absurd or stylistic mimicry. Nothing of these is new in the history of art and literature. So it is actually possible to regard any ironic work of any epoch as postmodernist. If we look through the prism of postmodernism at, for example, Alexander Pushkin's highly ironic poem Ruslan and Ludmila of 1820, we'll find the postmodernist poetics hard to defend as a coherent paradigm. Now, 30 years after the postmodern debate, we can return to the question how and where to place postmodernism with new knowledge. As regards literature, the case is that only few authors stayed exceptionally with the postmodernist poetics. It's Bret Easton Ellis, Christian Kracht and Vladimir Sorokin. For many other authors, writing a single postmodernist novel, as Kiss by Tatiana Tolstaya, Perfume by Patrick Süskind, or Last World by Christoph Ransmayr, did not result in remaining within the postmodernist paradigm. As to further development of postmodernist classics, I would like to take the examples of Vladimir Sorokin and Christoph Ransmayr. Vladimir Sorokin, in his recent works, Day of Oprichnik, Sugar, Kremlin, Telluria, uses similar postmodernist techniques, but he deconstructs not the Soviet discourse anymore, but the Russian traditionalist one that dominates Russian politics in the last 2 decades. Christoph Ransmayr experimented with various styles and genres after the novel The Last World, which was perceived as a postmodernist deconstruction of European history and culture since antiquity. And his latest work, Cox oder der Lauf der Zeit, is a well-researched historical novel, rather in a traditional understanding of this genre, that we developed in connection with realism. In general, the death of historical fiction proclaimed in the postmodern debate did not prove through time. In the last 30 years, outstanding German authors produced many successful historical novels. The most popular German writer in the world, Daniel Kehlmann, is one example. The impossibility of having an own style was also manifoldly disproven. We still very well recognize and value individual styles. My own favorites in German fiction are Christoph Franz Meyer and Daniel Kehlmann. Recently, the concept of post-truth, which is seen as a product of postmodernist paradigm, was discussed. This year, Klaus Benisch, professor of English and American Studies of the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, in his essay Is Truth to Post-Truth What Modernism is to Postmodernism, Heidegger, the Humanities and the Demise of Common Sense, expressed his concerns of the notion of post-truth that right-wing politicians and authoritarian regimes and fake news make use of. He said, I quote, "I argue that there is no such thing as post-truth. We are by no means in the middle of an unprecedented epistemological crisis that keeps us from telling right from wrong. Rather, what we are currently witnessing is a major breakdown of the institutions and mechanisms of democratic society triggered by an encompassing technological transformation that affects both our public and our private lives. True in its wake, truth claims have become increasingly contested and way more difficult to uphold." End of quote. As literary analyst, I can only support Klaus Benisch's denial of the post-truth concept and disclaim its connection with postmodernism. I am convinced that no one single postmodernist author whom I know celebrates the end of truth or any pluralism of various truths. When Patrick Süskind and Elfriede Jelinek deconstruct the totalitarian discourse of Nazi Germany, or when Vladimir Sorokin is making fun of the Soviet official language, and Bret Easton Ellis and Christian Kracht picture a yuppie lifestyle, their message is never pluralism of standpoints. In my view, these works are mainly about the power and omnipresence of discourse. They definitely use deconstruction to merely reflect on the facts that language is a mighty medium that predefines our worldview and that discourse might be difficult to withstand. Development in postmodernist literature in the last 30 years allows us to suppose that proclaiming postmodernism as a new era and cultural paradigm was probably too soon. But we obviously can preserve our understanding of postmodernism as a literary style or artistic method whose main features are deconstruction of a certain discourse and foregrounding of code, which are almost the only message of many works of 1960s to 1990s. This style is definitely influenced by the phenomenon of mass media and post-structuralism, but its connection to capitalism or any other economic or social system is disputable. Moreover, postmodernism as an art movement does not dismantle the concept of truth or any values. It shows how a consciousness manifests itself in the language and with what means a human being can be manipulated. Enriched by this knowledge that literary postmodernism is about, let's continue our search for truth.